My name is Nathan Brassfield, and I'm on staff at MTS in academic and alumni affairs, and I'm also a student in the DMin program, Doctor of Ministry in Land, Food, and Faith Formation. I think our Doctor of Ministry at MTS is very, very special, one of a kind. We have very interesting topics that you can do a DMin program in. So if you want to know more about that program, you can check out the website. I'm also the one that's been emailing with you all about Sunday Morning Seminary so far. So it's good to make a different sort of connection with you, even though I wish it had happened a few minutes ago. You can go to memphisseminary.edu/Sunday Seminary if you haven't already for a couple of important things. One, you can find recordings of all the previous Sunday Morning Seminary lessons. And two, you can find a link to make a quick donation for Sunday Morning Seminary. Like public radio or television, this is listener and viewer supported. So much like how WKNO here in Memphis will ask you to contribute, if you benefit from the service, that's exactly what we're asking from you if you are benefiting from Sunday Morning Seminary. We want this resource to be available to anyone who will join in. We don't want to have to set a price for this or do anything like that. We want it to be supported by groups and individuals at levels that are right for you. So you can visit memphisseminary.edu/Sunday Seminary to make your donation. And we thank you very much for being a part of making this happen. So we are about to get started with our new 2-Sunday lesson series on worship in a time of pandemic, led by Dr. Chris Davis. But before I introduce our professor, I want to remind you that you are not on camera and we can't hear you, but you can type in your questions at any time through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so that when we have time for discussion at the end, we'll have your question ready. Dr. Christopher Davis has been on the faculty at MTS since 2007 and is currently Associate Professor of Preaching and Pastoral Ministry and Associate Dean of Doctoral Studies. He's also been the Senior Pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church here in Memphis since 2000. He is one gifted preacher and teacher and has a lot of valuable knowledge and wisdom to provide about the life and mission of the local church. So, welcome, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and welcome to all of our participants. We are glad to have you with us for this seminary on Sunday. As I understand it, per the dean, my job on today is to give some thought or share some thoughts around worship in light of the current pandemic or the state of the world. So I really want to, over the course of the next 2 weeks, sort of shape my thoughts around this particular idea, and that is maintaining meaningful worshiping while sheltering at home. Maintaining meaningful worship while sheltering at home. Now, as you and I both know, state and local government across the country have issued shelter in place or stay at home orders. Now, we do also know that some have religious exemptions that allow local churches to continue to live stream from their houses of worship. As a matter of fact, that's what we're doing here at St. Paul Church. Other states, however, and municipalities explicitly ban any spiritual gathering. However, no matter the particulars of the local law, I firmly believe churches should be modeling public health behavior right now. And a part of modeling that behavior has either meant no face-to-face worship or restricted face-to-face worship with a limited number of participants. And as a result of this, most of us are now a part of what I want to call digital church. But we know even before COVID-19 made it necessary, opposed to a novelty, more and more Christians were choosing to watch worship services on TV, tablets, smartphones, and computers. This trend has affected and impacted attendance, volunteering, and giving. In fact, some churches have already closed their campuses in recognition of what they call the inevitable. They believed and touted that the digital church was the wave of the future. Now, many argued that what we were witnessing was not necessarily a wave of the future, but instead was a perversion of Romans 12. Rather than transforming, we were instead conforming. Instead of impacting the culture was really impacting the church. Well, Regardless to where you stood or stand on the argument, one thing is certain: digital church, virtual church, computer church, Facebook church, whatever you choose to call it, is here. And while a changing demographic may have introduced it, the coronavirus rather, has certainly hastened its arrival. So fear of the coronavirus has rippled across this country and directly into places of worship. And so as a result of that, religious leaders, mindful that cases have been discovered in all 50 states, have begun taking measures that would discourage, or at least could discourage, the spread of the virus in the large group common in churches and places of worship. They've asked congregants to change some familiar practices. Please do not hold the hand of the person closest to you when it's time for congregational prayer. When you walk into the church and greet friends, do not do it with a hug or a kiss on the cheek. Definitely do not shake hands. Communal cups used during communion have been whisked away, placed in storage until the threat of coronavirus has passed, and church employees have placed hand sanitizer bottles on every pew. These are some of the things that we're doing in response to corona. And I'm just trying to kind of lay out some foundational things upon which we're going to build. A survey by the Pew Research Center in April found more than 90% of regular churchgoers in the United States saying their churches had closed their doors to combat the spread of coronavirus, with the vast majority saying that worship services have moved entirely online. Social hours and church suppers are a thing of the past, at least for now. So as we can see, much is being done to maintain physical health, but what about spiritual health? Is our spiritual being not as important as our physical well-being? If so, then churches must continue to offer spiritual nourishment in the form of worship and directed study. But how do we do this? How could you plan worship for the purpose of keeping your members in the habit of regular worship until they can meet together again? How do you maintain meaningful worship while sheltering at home? Now, there are those who are reporting that stay at home has not been a bad thing. In fact, they are reporting increased attendance and interaction on the virtual platform. Even at the St. Paul Church where I serve, we have certainly seen increased numbers in terms of our weekly Bible study and things of that nature. So I, like some, am reporting increased attendance and interaction on this platform. However, I've got friends and colleagues, and perhaps this has been some of you all's experience, who are reporting that they're seeing a drifting away from the church. In some cases, you all, the coronavirus shutdown have weakened church connections. The Pew survey, and a survey by the Public Religions Research Institute, found that 1/3 or more of those who had previously attended church regularly were not bothering to watch online services. For those whose church affiliation was already tenuous, the disconnect may be permanent. Let me say it again. For those who were already sort of loosely connected to the church, this whole idea of sheltering at home may very well lead to a permanent disconnect from the church. Some persons who have been interviewed about their reduced church attendance during the pandemic have suggested that nothing really has changed. In fact, what they really said is they feel less guilty about not going. So when they were not necessarily attending face-to-face worship, they felt guilty, but they certainly feel less guilt in not simply connecting online. I think this suggests to you all that at least one thing, and that we would do well to take note of, and that is the way churchgoers are reacting to the pandemic depends in good part on their past experience. Let me say it again. The way that churchgoers are responding to this pandemic in terms of their attendance, in terms of worship, has a great deal to do with their past experience. Thus, if they weren't really connected prior to the pandemic, our immediate expectation should not be that they're going to log in. So I want to clear that up. We should not operate under the misnomer that simply because we're online now, that people are going to log in and be a part of the worship experience. And while there will be certain exceptions, you will in fact have some people to log in now that is virtual. It does not mean, what it does mean rather is that we might need to rethink the previous held notion that if church were more convenient, we would be overrun with more people. Let me say it again. When we were engaged in face-to-face worship, the long-held idea or thought was if church was more convenient, that more and more people would come. Well, I would say right now, you don't get much more convenient than this. You can wake up, log on, and there you have it. And if you don't feel like participating at that time, most churches who are using this virtual platform, they're simply recording it so that people can go back and watch at their convenience. But one of the things that I want to caution us on is simply because it's more convenient does not mean that we're certainly that we're getting ready to see this huge influx of persons or participants. Now, in the interest of transparency and full disclosure, let me say that I used to be a digital skeptic, unconvinced that virtual connectedness could foster any meaningful relating among us. However, getting pushed into this virtual world by a pandemic has provided all sorts of opportunities to reconsider my assumptions about how the world works, including my certainty that virtual connectivity is incapable of enriching our lives. Corona forced me out of the sanctuary. The mayor's executive order prohibited me from gathering with more than 15 people, sidelining me from in-person Sunday morning interaction, except with our church media team, a couple of musicians, a few singers, and my wife. So life as a seminary professor, a local church pastor, an active churchgoer, a participant in community events, all of it suddenly came to a screeching halt. But amid so much loss, I was introduced to the life-giving possibilities of virtual connectedness. And that's really what I want to sort of focus on over the course of these two sessions today and next week. This idea of the possibility of life-giving ministry or life-giving worship in the midst of this sort of virtual connectedness. And let me tell you what I experienced. Church members and friends stayed in touch through social media. They created chat groups, they shared pages, they recommended resources, and in the process, what they really did was created a virtual worshiping community. So that's bigger, that's different than just quote unquote online church. We're talking about a virtual worshiping community. These virtual connections were not simply poor substitutes for real interaction, but they filled my soul at a time of grieving what had been and while I was searching for what might be in this new reality. In fact, I think I echo the sentiments of many when I say, I'm not sure I would have survived or will continue to survive safer at home, also known as church outside the walls, without these virtual worshiping communities. And so let me pause for just a moment and ask, has anyone had a similar experience with virtual church? That is to say that virtual church has really become the means by which you have sort of been able to survive in the midst of this pandemic. I want you to think about that for a few minutes. I do know, of course, the way this is constructed, you can't just ask right now, but I do, of course, if you want to respond to that, just simply hold on. As a matter of fact, I see someone just posted, yes, that has been their experience. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because there suggests that while we may not be excited about these virtual worshiping communities, clearly there are some upsides and there are some benefits. So as both a professor and a practitioner, I must admit, I had not given the invisible church serious thought and or reflection, at least not the utility of such, prior to Corona. But when the pandemic prevented me from being physically present at a church, I was introduced to how the body of Christ exists virtually in profound and fulfilling ways. Thus, my newfound focus is the important role of the virtual body of Christ and how we might employ our digital tools to enhance our ability to live out our calling in the world. And so with the mass migration to virtual worship, churches faced a host of questions about how and whether or not key elements of worship can be carried out in virtual spaces. Now, let me ask, as a matter of fact, and of course, what is your immediate reaction to that particular statement? Can the key elements of worship be carried out in a virtual space? Now, the reason I raise that question is because we can't even have a conversation about how do you maintain meaningful worship while sheltering at home if you're not convinced that the key elements of worship can be carried out in these virtual spaces. In his book, Beyond the Worship Wars, Dr. Thomas Long noted that Christian worship in America at the turn of the 21st century is in a restless mood. And while I can certainly appreciate Dr. Long's sentiment, I must say, if ever there was an understatement, that would have to be it. Restless does not begin to describe the challenges associated with worship planning, with performance, with style, etc. And that was before shelter in place. We were already trying to figure out how to effectively do worship even before we entered into this brave new world. In many congregations, worship had already undergone a sea of change, and almost everything has a new look and a fresh sound. The music, the language, the mood, the style of sermons, the physical space, the day and times of worship, the leadership, even the clothing that worshipers wear. All of that stuff had changed. For some congregations, these changes in worship are just a part of a more comprehensive definition of what it means to be a church in relationship to the culture. And I tell you what else I've discovered. Even in the most traditional churches, where the pace of change is typically slower and much more cautious, there is a growing sense that we cannot do business as usual anymore, and that worship styles must adjust to new cultural realities. Prior to the pandemic, whenever we heard worship wars, we immediately thought about disagreements over the music, that is contemporary service versus the traditional service. But Corona has introduced an entirely new factor for us to war over. The new cultural reality that we're going to be discussing is virtual worship. What does that look like? How do we do it? Can it be done with theological integrity? Can it be done in such a way that it provides to our congregants what it is they've come to expect out of worship? Now, to begin with, I think it's important that we note that worship from home is biblical. Now, while many of us are uncomfortable with it, we've been forced into it by Corona. I think it's important for us to point out that worship from home is biblical. Thus, what the pandemic has really done is push us back to the Bible. Now, I want to frame it that way because I think if I frame it that way, some of the anxiety that we experience around it will begin to subside. This whole idea of sheltering at home, worshiping at home, that you all is biblical. In the early days of the church, there was not one temple or synagogue where the followers of the way gathered. There was not a church building. There was not a temple. There was not a synagogue. They gathered in house churches, private residences where they worshiped God. So even now, as families gather around the TV screen, the computer monitor, whatever the case may be, in order to participate in virtual worship, that is much akin to what they would have experienced in the early Christian church. But here's the question I think we're grappling with. How did they know how to worship? What instruction could they share with the people, with their people? And is that not really our biggest concern as it pertains to virtual worship? Without the time-tested delivery system of face-to-face worship in a sanctuary, how do we ensure that those who are worshiping at home are quote unquote doing it right, if there is such a thing? In face-to-face worship, oftentimes we could mimic what others were doing, or we could model for those who were gathered. This is what worship looks like. But if people are doing it at home, how can we be certain that they're doing it right? Well, consider this. The New Testament letters of Paul were the sources of instruction, letters written to specific communities and sent to those communities. Now, I want to reiterate the fact that what Paul wrote were specific letters to specific communities. Specific letters to specific communities, which suggests that a cookie cutter approach to virtual worship will not work. We do not have the luxury of looking at what other people are doing in their virtual service and simply copying that and say that will do. Paul did not advocate a cookie cutter approach as he was writing these letters. And as we plan virtual worship that is going to be meaningful, we must resist the temptation to use a cookie cutter approach. We must give serious consideration to who initially makes up our virtual worship community and plan accordingly. Now, the reason I say we have to think about who initially makes up our worshiping community is because we understand that as we take advantage of technology, there are going to be people who are going to stumble across our site or experience our worship service who were not initially a part of our virtual, our worshiping community, our congregation. But one of the things that I share with my students at MTS, what you cannot do is plan for those that you hope will come or might come and ignore those who are there. So even as we talk about planning virtual worship and maintaining meaningful worship rather, we must be mindful of the congregation or the participants that we are aware of, not those that we are hoping will come because they've logged onto our website, which means if your congregation is made up of predominantly seniors without internet access or internet savvy, then Facebook may not be the answer. Facebook Live or Zoom may not be the answer. Perhaps a calling tree may provide a better delivery system. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who wants to be utilizing a calling tree when all of your friends and neighbors are utilizing Facebook Live and Zoom and their website? Well, understand, in this new virtual world, we cannot bring into this virtual world that same spirit of competition that we had when we were worshiping face to face. In my community, we used to call it keeping up with the Joneses, where you have to resist the temptation to keep up with the church down the street. As we plan meaningful worship during a pandemic, you have to take into consideration what works best for your congregation. So if that means a dial-in number where you hear one another's voice and not necessarily see one another like we're doing on Zoom or webinar or Facebook, then that may be the best approach for your particular congregation. You got to resist the temptation to do what others are doing simply because you want to be cutting edge. Well, even beyond the fact that Paul sent those letters, we now have to raise the question, how were the letters sent to the congregation? Well, we know Paul used the Roman road system to send mail. I want to suggest that you and I are being presented with a wonderful opportunity to rethink or reimagine the internet. Hear me out. I want us to rethink or reimagine, the usefulness and the purpose of the internet, because I'm suggesting that the internet is just a faster version of Paul's delivery system. So for those who are staunch biblicists, for those who are traditionalists, listen, you need to know that the internet is just a faster version of Paul's delivery system. We are living into the early Christian method right now. Use the avenues available to communicate the gospel. Paul used letters and Roman roads, and you and I can use our crafted liturgies, our prayers, our messages, our music, and yes, the internet. It's the same message distributed just like the early church. We're just able to do it a bit faster, and we're able to push it out a bit further to a much larger gathering. So there's not a great deal of difference between what we're doing and what Paul did in the early days of the church. Now that we've established that the internet and virtual church could be a return to the practice of the early church, we must now examine the what of virtual worship. I think that's one of the things that concerns me. Since we have been sort of pushed into this bold new world, we've sort of focused on how we're supposed to do it. How are we supposed to get on Facebook? How are we supposed to get on the internet? How are we supposed to do worship? Well, I want to pull us away from the how and challenge us to think about the what of virtual church. The current corona crisis is making people think about what's essential to their faith. It's like when you have a sauce cooking. I like to think of myself as a bit of a shade tree chef. I've often said that when I retire from full-time ministry, I'm going to go to culinary school and I'm going to live the second half of my life as a chef. So if you consider yourself a bit of a chef or a home cook, then you know when you have a sauce cooking, you reduce it to its core elements. Thus, we have to take a careful look at what are the core elements of our faith. We've got to look at the simple things. In other words, we must rethink what church is all about. If Corona hadn't done anything else, it has challenged us to rethink about what is church. Can the church continue to be the church outside of the walls of the church building? So even as we rethink church, it is also challenging us to rethink worship. Now, one of the biggest reasons that faith and religious communities exist is to overcome feelings of isolation and loneliness, vulnerability and separation. The sense of growing separation from one's church community under pandemic conditions may be the most acute for those who have depended on that community for support. Let me say it again. Those who are sort of dealing with this sense of growing separation, that sense of loneliness is going to be most acute for those who have really depended on these communities for support. This reason for existence suggests that we can't simply shut down the church and ride it out. We can't just wait for the pandemic to pass and get back to business as usual. What worship provides is still needed. Thus, we must really examine, why do people come to worship? It is only in exploring this will we then be able to create a virtual worship experience that motivates people to log in for worship, opposed to a round of golf, a couple of hours in the garden, or a casual Sunday morning lingering over a bagel and reading the Sunday paper. We must go back and critically re-examine, why do people participate and what are their expectations? Now, you and I both know people come to worship for any number of reasons. Some come from habit, some come from gratitude, some come from guilt, some from loyalty, some come because they have a spouse who coaxes or coerces them, others come because they have a child who needs to be brought up right. Support, solace, and a spiritual bond are some of the things that matter most in a worship experience. Now, I think at this point, it is both reasonable and responsible to point out that for some people, those things that are needed and expected from worship are also the things they now realize their church was not providing. Now, I know that may be hard for some of us to hear, but in this virtual space where we're sort of rethinking church and rethinking worship, and people are reflecting, there are people that we're trying to keep connected who are now reflecting upon the fact, what I expected from worship, what I needed for worship, so even when we were meeting face to face, these needs were not being met. These things were not being provided. So even as we think about maintaining meaningful worship virtually, we cannot ignore the fact that some were already questioning if it was meaningful, even when it was face to face. So why do people come to worship? We need to be careful about how we look for answers. The thought is that if we can learn what motivates people to come to worship, we can learn how to duplicate or accentuate those aspects for the virtual setting. Thus, we make and or keep worship attractive while we're waiting on the green light to go back into the sanctuary. Now, at one level, this theory is true. But at another level, asking what motivates people to come to worship may turn out to be the wrong question, maybe even a dangerous question. Now, at the risk of sounding circular in my reasoning or confusing in my presentation, let me say, people need to worship. People need to worship. Worshiping God is not simply a good thing to do. It is a necessary thing to do in order for us to be fully human. We need to join with others in bowing before God in worshipful acts of devotion, praise, obedience, thanksgiving, and petition. Thus, for those of you who are planners of worship, we do not, how do I want to say this? Those of us who are responsible for planning worship, we do not make worship meaningful. Worship is already meaningful. Let me say it again. No matter how creative we are, no matter how tech savvy we are, we can never make worship meaningful. Worship is already meaningful. We do not manufacture worship that addresses people's deepest needs. True worship already meets those needs. It is important to keep reminding ourselves of the strange truth that, odd as it may sound, worship is best measured not by how popular, inspirational, beautiful, educational, musically rich, poetic, exciting, or well attended it is. While good worship often contains all of these things, true worship has its own beauty. It summons the best of language, music, and the arts, and powerfully lifts the human heart into the presence of God. So in essence, worship is what happens when people become aware that they are in the presence of the living God. Thus, our task and our focus for next week, by the way, will be to consider how do we usher people into God's presence on a virtual platform. And we're going to look very closely at some of the practical ways we do that, specifically through sacrament and sermon. That is to say, we want to look at, in a virtual world, how do we practice the sacrament? What type of sermon should we be crafting in a virtual world if we're looking to maintain meaningful worship while people are sheltering at home? Now, I think what I want to do at this point is sort of pause right here, because I've been talking nonstop for at least the last 20 minutes. I want to pause right here and begin to entertain some of the questions that you may have. I trust Nathan has been sort of logging those. So Nathan, let's hear what their questions are. Okay.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Having some difficulty unmuting myself. Yeah, while people are thinking and typing, I just want to say I think that was absolutely profound what you just said about worship not being a production or performance. You know, especially with the virtual worship, it's like lights, camera, action. You know, that's
Right.
what we're doing now, and that can really make you think about your presentation and why you can't be faithful without aiming for quality. Of course, this does not. Nothing depends on quality. You can't manufacture meaning. Worship is meaningful and valuable, and you know that's a reminder to take back to when we are in person. You know that this is a situation in which the yoke is easy and the burden is light. When you are coming as a humble worshiper, it's not about judging your own performance, which is so easy to do as a church leader, and it's not about judging the performance of anybody else. So yeah, I think that was a just profound point.
Well, thank you. And the reason I wanted to point that out is because one of my concerns, even in the church setting, is sort of the spirit of competition, where we feel like we're in competition with other churches. And my concern became, even as we start looking at virtual worship, we were starting to see that, where some churches were concerned that they didn't have the technology that other churches had. They didn't have people who were internet savvy. So how would they be able to keep up with other churches? And I really want to sort of move the focus from that, so that those who aren't in a position to do large productions will recognize that you can still engage in meaningful, purposeful, impactful worship if you force yourself to keep at the forefront of your planning what the real purpose of worship is.
We have someone asking, I like your analogy of the reduction of a sauce to the essential flavors. What are the essentials that need to be considered in worship?
Well, I think we have to. Interestingly enough, I think it's word, it's sacrament, it's table, it's connectivity. I guess what I'm really saying is, for me, worship is really about people. It is about people moving into an intimate relationship with the living God and a relationship with one another. And the way we do that through word, we do that through sacrament, we do that through fellowship. I think at the end of the day, you know, those are the key elements. We have to think about word, we have to think about sacrament, we have to think about fellowship. And so if we focus on those, how do we effectively do that? Then again, as we said a few minutes ago, that will move us away from lights, camera, action.
Mm-hmm. Question right after that is, how can we celebrate the sacraments?
Well, I don't want to answer that today, only because if I answer that today, then I have to go back and rewrite next week's lecture. So hold that question until next week, because on next week, I want to deal specifically with sacrament and sermon in a virtual world.
Any ideas about doing things like children's Sunday school?
Well, the truth of the matter is, of course, much like the adults, of course, now the upside is children tend to be much more technologically savvy. So now one of the things that we've done in my local church, interestingly enough, I've really sort of been a proponent, Nathan, during this time of the family gathering for worship. You know, saying mom, dad, kids, whatever family may look like, just bringing the family together. So what we've done is later in the day, we've intentionally planned a separate children's worship where they're able to log on. So we're trying to schedule games and activities and so forth so that they will know that this was intentionally designed for them. We've resisted the temptation to try to do it at the same time that we would do our normal worship, simply because we were thinking about, well, first of all, we couldn't do it. And then we wondered how many households had separate devices where they would be in separate services at the same time. So we've opted in our worship planning to sort of plan service in such a way where it invites the entire family, and then do something separate a little later in the day, specifically for the children and the young people.
It looks like all the questions for now. Someone is mentioning the, and I've seen this too, how churches have had, aside from virtual opportunities, drive-in opportunities, drive-in service for communion. What do you think about that, Dr. Davis?
Well, now, of course, we've done it as well here at my local church. Now, what we've done is we had one service on the parking lot so that we could sort of see one another face to face. Now, as it pertains to the sacrament, specifically communion, what we've done in my local church, we share the table on the first Sunday, and we've continued to do so virtually. Now, we've done that two ways. We've designated days when sort of the elders and deacons of the church were present, and so that members could come by the church and pick up the sacraments so that they would be able to participate in their homes virtually. Now, what we've also said to our congregations, for those who are not comfortable in doing that, to utilize what you have available in your home. So whatever juice you have available at home, whatever, whatever cracker you have at home, whether that's a piece of Wonder Bread or that's a saltine cracker or Ritz, I mean, whatever you have available, we're going to pray, we're going to consecrate those things, and we're still going to share the spirit of the table.
That's a profound point in itself, that doing things like this can really put us in touch with what a sacrament really is.
Absolutely.
There's nothing about the wheat, water, makeup itself. What makes it a sacrament is something, largely inexpressible, but it's beyond just the elements.
Right.
And for my DMin program, I've been doing some research and for a final paper in the current course, and I've discovered that for a long time, I just started doing research in this book. For a long time, people did bring some kind of bread, some kind of wine from their homes, for worship, which I thought was really profound.
The church that I grew up in, True Vine Missionary Baptist Church in New Hart, Arkansas, on Highway 147 South. Listen, of course, we had church mothers who would actually bake the bread for Communion Sunday, and they made the wine. None of this prefab stuff in the little grape juice stuff. No, I mean, they would actually, and I mean, in the method, they would take like muscadines and plums and so forth. They would actually make the communion wine and bake the bread. As a matter of fact, I'm almost ashamed to admit this, but of course, when we were kids growing up, when we got baptized, because I come out of a faith tradition that argues, of course, that the table is for those who are a part of this particular community. And the way we do so is when you're sort of baptized into this particular community. So for those of us who grew up in the church as kids, when we were baptized, it is not because we had this awesome encounter with God. We wanted that homemade wine and that bread.
Yeah, that's not a part of it too.
Is that a motivating factor?
It was real food that y'all had. And, you think about the Last Supper, they didn't have to, go out and get it from the church supply store. It was what they had, it was their food. Absolutely. We do have some other questions here. Let's see. Someone has asked how you see us dealing with social distancing fellowship, which I'm assuming that means people who are in person, but maybe doing the whole requirements. distance.
And I think we have to do just that. We have to practice those social distance in terms of sort of keeping the designated space, the 6 feet apart, recognizing that some of the things that we've done prior to the hugging, the greeting, and so forth, at this particular juncture, we simply cannot do it. And in spaces where I've been, where we've tried to practice worship, social distancing, one of the things that we discovered while we miss shaking hands and hugging, it still does the heart good just to be able to see you. That, so that's one of the things that we sort of miss in this virtual experience. So even in social distance setting, just to be able to look over one pew 6 feet down and see another human being and just sort of wave, that still does the heart good in terms of fellowship.
Hey, any more questions? You can submit them through the Q&A. I will see that, or you can submit them through the chat feature.
So, like I said, and like on today, like I said, really, all I really want to do is today was sort of kind of lay a foundation. But next week, I'm sort of excited because next week we sort of move into more of the practical stuff, the nuts and bolts in terms of what the sacrament and sermon look like in the virtual community. So I'm certainly looking forward to next week. So. Any more questions, Nathan?
One more question.
Okay.
Well, actually, not one more, but here's one more that just popped up.
Okay.
What if this pandemic extends longer, more prolonged than what we think?
Well, I think it is going to, last longer than what we think, which is so important for us to be having these conversations about maintaining meaningful worship. Because the reality is, I have no expectation of us going back into the sanctuary next week or even next month, for that matter. So I think we need to start to prepare ourselves in a very real way that this could last much longer than what we thought. So since that's the case, you'll say, how can we be responsive? How can we maintain, our theological integrity and engage in meaningful worship across these various platforms?
All right, that looks like it's it as far as questions go.
Well,
Dr. Davis, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I'm getting ready to get off of here and slide into my virtual sanctuary so I can get into worship.
All righty.
Well, Nathan, thank you so much. Thank you to all of those who logged on, and I look forward to continuing the journey on next week as we look at sacrament and sermon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis.
Thank you, Nathan.
All right, everybody. Well, we hope you will join us for the second half of Dr. Davis's lesson series on next Sunday. I invite you to send me any insights or special things that you or your church members are doing to worship in a time of pandemic. My email address is on the Sunday Morning Seminary webpage. You can also let me know if you have any questions or suggestions in the meantime. So thank you to each of you for joining us today. Please stay cool, drink water, and be safe for yourself and for others. And we will see you next time.